Hello and welcome back. So week 17 is All-Star week, and that's a wonderful thing for me personally, as my eyes are currently bleeding from looking at so many schedules over the last few days for the playoff schedule video and then this video. So I'll be very happy to not have to look at another schedule for 2 weeks, but my bleeding eyes means wins for your fantasy team, especially this week where you can actually manipulate the schedule in your favor, and you'll likely need to adapt to a 2-game week because a couple of teams do have that. So let's look at the preliminary schedule. So this is the overview. 49 games in week 17 are spread across 2 weeks with a sprinkling of games this Monday through Wednesday. Then there's a break. And then the next Monday, the following Monday, is when the rest of the games continue. And across that whole span, there are 9 teams that play 4 games, 7 teams that play 2 times, and then you can see them here: Boston, Buffalo, LA, Nashville, Ottawa, St. Louis, Winnipeg. You'll see them on the next page as well. So if you have these goaltenders, you're probably going to have to do something to meet the minimum start threshold, something that I seem to have forgotten about this particular week. So I might not hit my goalie start threshold for this week because I was busy doing other stuff. And then these teams all have 4 games. So let's jump to the next slide so you can see how this breaks down. These are the teams with 4 games up at the top. I'm not going to read them all. You can see them all there. But the way that this works out, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, they're all light nights. Then there's the break. Then you come back. Monday, Tuesday are relatively heavy by this standard. 6 games. You're going to get everybody in your lineup for most of the week. Wednesday's a light night. Thursday is relatively light, but still 7 games. Friday's pretty light. Saturday, this is the only day where there's going to be some difficulty getting guys into the lineup. So take that into consideration. And then Sunday's pretty light as well. Now, none of the teams that play 4 times have any games during the first stretch from Monday to Wednesday, but you can play this week like this to get the maximum amount of games. You can start the week with a couple of Canes ads, and they'll get you a game on Tuesday and Wednesday. It is a back-to-back with travel, so keep that in the back of your mind, but you can pick those guys up for these 2 games, then drop them, and then you have plenty of time over the course of that break to plot out your next move. But you can pick up one of these guys from one of these teams or any of these teams that play 4 times, and that will give you 6 games from one roster spot. You do have to make a move or 2 to get that done, but nonetheless, it can maximize your schedule for this week, and that could be beneficial because nobody else will probably be paying attention during that span during the All-Star game and whatnot, so you'll have a little bit of an advantage. Now, the teams with some of the best schedules, these are in no particular order, but the Islanders do have a pretty decent schedule, all things considered. Monday, Tuesday, back-to-back with minimal travel. Going from Philly to Long Island is not that bad. Then they're home to face the Canucks in the middle of the week on that Thursday, and then they're in Montreal for that Saturday matchup, which is kind of favorable for them. They've been struggling lately. They're starting to find their footing a little bit, getting a little healthier. So we'll get into that in just a minute. The Flyers, all 4 games of the Flyers are at home. So the Islanders, Oilers, and then a back-to-back with Nashville and Seattle. Some decent opponents that they're going to have some trouble with, but there are some winnable games here, and the Flyers have been playing a little bit better lately, and we'll get into that as well. Seattle, Eastern road trip, all 4 games on the road with a road back-to-back at Jersey and the Rangers. That will be difficult. The Isles and the Flyers games could provide some offense, though. They don't have any games on the busy Saturday schedule, which does ensure that your Kraken ads will get in almost every night, if not every night. So that is something to keep in mind. If you wanted to do this stack, maybe you pick up the Canes for these 2, and then you pick up the Kraken, so you're guaranteed 6 games. You won't have to sit a guy out on that Saturday. And then last but not least, Edmonton, all 4 road games. They're making a little Eastern swing. 0 playoff teams right now as we speak. So the competition is relatively set for them to put up some goals. And then obviously they have the road back-to-back with Ottawa and Montreal at the tail end of it. But let's start with the Carolina ads so you can start off this little schedule play. Now, there's nobody on Carolina that I'd be looking to add in general right now because none of them are, none of the ownable guys are doing much. Everybody who's performing is relatively owned up. But it is worth noting that Teuvo Teravainen has 5 points in his last 5 games. He's on line 1 and power play 1. So if you're into riding hot streaks, that's really the only ad that there is for this week that's hot. Everybody else is kind of cold. 62% owned, dual eligible. So he might not be there for you in your league. So the only other way to play this is to look at line exposure and hope for the best. So Kotkaniemi, second line center with Svechnikov and Nechas. Nechas is hot right now, so that may be an ad just trying to get exposure to him. Kotkaniemi typically sucks in fantasy and is not fantasy relevant at all. This is Teravainen's card, so you can see here Teravainen a little bit better offensively, and then Kotkaniemi is a little bit worse offensively. Not much to write home about here. Not a lot of shot volume. Points aren't really there. Nothing really to salivate over for the Kotkaniemi ad. Now, he's literally never once been on one of my rosters, and the only reason I'm recommending him here is that line exposure. So if that changes, then he's completely unownable, so don't even think about it. The most consistent player and or complete player to add is Seth Jarvis, and that's been the case for most of the season. He's a 65 on the player rating on the player hub here. He gets about 1 hit per game and covers everything relatively well. Just over 2 shots per game. 81st percentile is his best category coverage. But he only has 1 point in his last 5, and he's young, so he will be streaky and relatively inconsistent, all things considered. But these are some of the best ads. Obviously, you can look at Brady Shea. He's been relatively hot. I believe he's 44% owned, and we've covered him in a couple of previous videos. So just double check his stats. He's relatively high up there on the data draft player board. But yeah, some of these guys are just not performing in the last week or two, so there's nothing to write home about. Now, in terms of the teams with the 4-game weeks, the Islanders, it's been very difficult mining fantasy value out of the Isles, but it's getting slightly better as we move through the season. The Islanders, obviously Matt Martin is the one guy that you're just going to own him for hits. And if you look at in the last 8 games, 55 hits in those 8 games, 6.87 hits per game is kind of insane. So he's definitely a hits guy that's relatively consistent for your team. 8% owned, left wing, single eligible, does hurt his ownability a little bit. And then there's Brock Nelson, who will be at the All-Star game in Sunrise. 7 points in his last 8 games. He's the second most complete player in category leagues, as you can see here, just a shade below Anders Lee. So that means he covers a little bit of everything, and he's going to potentially be a little bit tired coming back from that All-Star break and then having to come right back on Monday night and do a back-to-back. But nonetheless, he's a pretty decent option. There's not a lot to go off of on Long Island. You have Kyle Palmieri, who has returned from injury, and he's been pretty good. 5 assists in his last 4 games, 11 shots, 12 hits. And because of those peripherals and that production, he went up about 7 points on the Data Draft Player Hub. You can see it right here. He's now a 65, almost a 66 because of this 1 week and because he was returning off of injury. So he's trending in the right direction. He's usually a goal scorer, so I don't know why the goals aren't there, but the assists are. But nonetheless, 5% owned. He's a decent option in a deep league kind of situation. And then last but not least, it appears as though Anders Lee has started to find his goal scoring touch again. 4 goals in his last 4 games, and that's definitely the longer term ad if you want an Islander. Now, he leads the player rankings for the Islanders, 76 overall. And if you look at his player hub, 91st percentile in goals, 90th in shots. That's what you'd own him for, but he is pretty much getting you a little bit of everything, some hits, a couple of blocks here and there, some power play production, and he usually scores power play goals. It hasn't been coming lately. He's usually a 30-goal scorer with a decent amount of power play production, so hopefully he can get back to that. This is a little bit low, his point per game numbers, compared to what he's usually used to doing. So hopefully the second half of the season is more favorable for Anders Lee, because he is usually one of those guys, a net front presence that doesn't take a lot of shots in order to score goals. I mean, he takes shots in terms of volume, but he doesn't need a ton to score goals if he's parking himself in front of that net. So these are some of the best Islanders owns. Pretty much everybody else I would stay away from, other than JG Pageau for face-off leagues and things like that. We've covered him in the previous week, so not going to go into too much detail there. Now, just a quick reminder of what we're looking at here. We went over the first 2 teams. We still have Philly, Seattle, and Edmonton. Just wanted to give you a quick overview so you didn't lose track of where we are in terms of what we're covering. So now let's move to the Philadelphia Flyers. And keep in mind that the guys that are hot right now might cool off with this long extended break. And there are some guys on Philly who have been hot. And the hottest guy is Owen Tippett. So 1 goal, 3 assists, 14 shots in his last 4 games, top line minutes, and he is the 3rd highest rated player from the Flyers on the Player Hub, meaning he's very complete. He improved 1.4 points last week. And then if you look at his numbers, his shot volume has been pretty good all season, 88th percentile. His goal numbers, 87th percentile, and he's above 60th percentile in everything. So getting some hits, getting some blocks, a little bit of power play time. The production is coming. And obviously the last week he's been one of the hottest Flyers to own. 14 shots in 4 games is also really good. So 7% owned, dual eligible. That's the guy that I'd be targeting. I have him in one of my leagues, and he's been pretty productive over the last couple of days. Now the next best guy, this is a very consistent player, Kevin Hayes. 5 goals, 3 assists, 3 power play points, 28 shots in his last 8 games. And then on screen, you see what he did in the last week. 4 points in 4 games, 2 power play points. He's 49% owned. He may or may not be there for you. And he is also going to the All-Star game and then has to come back and deal with this Monday game against the Islanders. So that is something to think about in terms of Kevin Hayes' ad. But one of the hottest Flyers outside of this, one of the lesser owned Flyers, is Noah Cates. Only 1% owned, center, left wing, dual eligible, 5 points in his last 5 games, 3 goals, 2 assists, 1 power play point, and he's currently playing second line center between Joel Farabee and Travis Konechny, which is excellent line exposure. Now, I've been seeing his name in the top 6 for a big chunk of the season. The production hasn't been there. It is now. He's relatively hot. I just wonder if that stays through the break and he comes back and picks up where he left off. That would be the only concern. But for deep leagues, 1% owned, that's a guy to definitely target in 16-team leagues, 18, 20-team leagues, whatever. He's been getting it done lately. Morgan Frost is actually also centering the first line, and he's been a little bit colder, but a similar deep league play if you're interested. I believe he's a center. I think he has dual eligibility. But nonetheless, those 2 guys are pretty good for deep league options. Now, for defensemen, there are 3 interesting files here, and we'll start with Ristolainen and Provorov. So Risto is 98th percentile in blocks, 85th in hits. Usually that's what he's good for, but this week he put up a goal, 3 assists, 4 points in 4 games. So maybe he's found a little bit of an offensive touch, which obviously hasn't been there all season. That's what is lacking from Ristolainen. He's obviously elite level in blocks coverage and then pretty good in hits as well, 2.16, 2.23. You're getting good coverage there, but you're not getting a lot of offense until this past week. The better D ad is usually Ivan Provorov. He's 40% owned, 99th percentile in blocks, just a shade above Ristolainen in that regard. A little bit lower on the hits column, so that's going to change your opinion if you need a hits and blocks guy. But he does get a little bit more offensive production, assists, some shots, a little bit of power play time. I believe that's like 1 or 2 power play points that he's got on the year. So nothing crazy, but he is a little bit more offensive. And when you compare them side by side, this is why Provorov is so much higher up, because he's, this is almost no production at all out of Ristolainen, and you're getting something out of Provorov. But there is one other player I wanted to mention, and that's the emergence of Cam York. Currently playing top pair with Provorov. He would have been an AHL All-Star if he weren't with the big club. He apparently has a 94% wins above replacement, according to Top Down Hockey and Jay Fresh. And since he made his season debut on December 9th, the Flyers are 12-8-4. So it hasn't quite translated to fantasy relevance yet. He's a 52 on the Player Hub, but he is 81st percentile in assists and 86th in blocks. So he's starting to get there. Now, just a quick reminder, if you want any of these Player Hubs, you can find them in the Patreon link in the description below. I also have a Player Hub comparison tool that looks almost exactly like this. So you can use it to compare players side by side and get a better sense of what you're going to potentially add off the waiver wire. Do you like this guy? Do you like that guy? What does this guy do for you? That's a great tool to have, especially if you're trying to make a trade proposal. If you're, looking at 2 guys on the waiver wire, that's an excellent tool to use. I've been using it pretty much every single day, not only to make these videos, but to make decisions for my team. So you can find that in the Patreon link in the description below. But as we move to Seattle, There are so many guys that you could own. I've been talking about this team all year for a reason. The Kraken are 5th in the NHL in goals per game with 3.61, and they score by committee. So on any given night, any of their players can get stats for your team. If you look at their player rankings on the left, typically for a 12-team league, what I look for is like 70 and above. Mid 60s is okay. It's acceptable. And sometimes there's guys in the mid 60s or below that are elite level in one or two categories that I can, make the adjustment and pick them up because they have, maybe 3.5 shots per game or something like that. So what you see here is almost everyone on their team is, close to ownable in a 12 or 14 team league. Anybody from maybe Brandon Tanev up, even Wenberg has been climbing. Yanni Gourde hasn't been quite as good as you'd like. Alexiak, you're going to get hits and some other coverage. I mentioned Will Borgen at times. A couple of these guys have been, highlighted at various points. Obviously, the guys at the top are a little bit better. So what you're looking at here from this past week, Jared McCann was the best Kraken ad, 4-point week in 3 games, a goal, 3 assists, 2 power play points, 11 shots. He's still one of the hottest goal scorers in the NHL. If you look at goals above expected, he's still in the top 15. He's an elite shooter in the league, and you're starting to see some usage on the power play. He's got those 2 power play points. He's dual eligible, 29% owned, so this is always a good ad. I always look to Jared McCann if he's on the wire and if I'm in need of a Seattle Kraken player. Now, I mentioned Adam Larson a couple videos ago. He's an elite level hits and blocks D type of guy, but he's been getting some offensive production. That pairing with Vince Dunn, obviously Vince Dunn is at the top of the Kraken player rankings for the hits and blocks data draft player hub. So Vince Dunn has been extremely complete. I've been using him for the past couple of weeks. Adam Larson's his D pair, and he's been pretty good as well. 3 assists, 9 shots, 4 hits, 6 blocks in the last 3 games. You get a little bit of everything. He's 68% owned, so he may not be there for you, but they do have a bunch of options, even on the back end, that you're going to want to look to, especially if you're trying to replace Justin Schultz, who's apparently out for a couple weeks. I believe torn MCL, something like that. I could be wrong about that. It's been a long week. But one of the best offensive stories, there's been 2 down here at the bottom that we have to touch on. Oliver Bjorkstrand, 8% owned, single position right winger, 2 goals, 2 assists, 4 points, 6 shots in his last 3 games. Excellent production. He's a guy who typically I would consider an elite goal scorer. It just hasn't happened for him this year, but now he could be finding his stride. Hopefully this doesn't get derailed by the break. And then Eli Tolvanen, 10% owned, dual eligible, 3-game goal streak, and 6 goals in his last 11 games. He's another one of those guys, kind of like McCann, who's an elite shooter. I believe he's on the second power play unit right now. And as long as he's going to be, if they can continue to give him an opportunity in the top 6 or even in the middle 6, that's definitely a guy to keep your eye on if you need goal production. And a lot of you do in those points leagues that weight goals a little bit heavier. So these are some deep options. There's guys all up and down this lineup that you can target. Jordan Eberle, Daniel Sprong. We've talked about a lot of these guys at various points in the season. And that's a complete contrast to the next team that we're going to talk about, which is the Edmonton Oilers. So I don't know if you can see that green line on the player hub right here, but everybody above this is at least 50% owned. Bouchard's 51, Barry is 75% owned, and everybody else is not ownable. So if you look, you're not going to get access to any of these guys who you would want, and anybody below this line you're not going to want because they're nowhere near fantasy relevant. So even Kostin, Yamamoto, I mean, you're really scraping the bottom of the barrel to try to, find something. And I just didn't want to, do a deep dive and tell you to pick up Jesse Puljujarvi or something when he's a 37. So there's really nothing to write home about in terms of Edmonton ads. And then on top of that, McDavid and Draisaitl are going to the All-Star game. And then right after they go to the All-Star game, they're going out on a 4-game road trip. So I don't like the fact that they're going to be potentially exhausted after that, including this weekend back-to-back with travel involved. So that may not actually impact McDavid and Draisaitl, but it could impact guys that feed off of them, Hyman, Barry, etc. So just keep that in mind if you're looking for Edmonton ads this week. It's pretty slim pickings. Now, best of the rest, the other teams that play 4 times this week, there's some other good options here. Now, the Ducks have gotten semi-hot lately. Several players in the top 100 in fantasy over the last 2 weeks, guys like Zegras, Terry, Vetrano, but we'll focus on Cam Fowler. Now, usually a very steady defenseman, borderline fantasy ownable in a 12-team league, but over his last 7 games, 7 points, 3 goals, 4 assists, 1 power play point, 18 shots, so he's been much better lately, climbing into that realm of ownability at a 62. You get the power play production, you get some assists, you get some blocks, 1 block per game, no hits coverage at all. That kind of drags him down a bit. The rest of his offense is pretty good. Half a point per game for a defenseman is not bad. So he's been a little bit better as of late, so he could potentially become an option moving forward. Now, another Ducks player that's been pretty hot is Adam Henrique. 7 points in his last 7 as well, including 5 goals and 20 shots in that span. And he's a little bit more ownable, 67 overall, 0.6 points per game. His goal production is actually 92nd percentile, very good there. Not a lot of hits coming from him. So if you don't have hits and blocks, some of these guys become a little bit more valuable. 2 shots per game is good, not great. And there is a little bit of power play production there as well. So that's what you're going to get out of Adam Henrique. He's 13% owned, dual eligible center left wing. One of the guys that I've been looking at for a while, Filipito's been playing really well all season. He's driving whatever line he's on, but whenever they unite the boys to men line, formerly known as the kid line, they have great chemistry and the production increases for all 3. So Hedl, 7 points in his last 6, including 5 points in his last 3 games. Lafreniere, 3 points in his last 3 games since being reunited with this line, and Kakko, 3 assists in his last 3 games. So when they put these guys together, they have excellent chemistry and they get it done in the offensive zone. They're hounding on the puck. You can watch the highlights from some of the goals they scored this past week. Now, Hedl, a little bit surprising, 93rd percentile in goal production. That's really good, and I didn't expect that. I've been watching the Rangers all year, and he's definitely noticeable every game, but I didn't expect to see him this high in the goal production, especially since he doesn't get a lot of power play time. And that's the one thing. He does have some power play production because the last couple of weeks he's been getting, the odd 30 to 45 second shift on the power play, and they've actually been making the most of it. But nonetheless, he's been an excellent option. I have him in my face-off league. He's been doing pretty well there. Center, right wing, dual eligible, 17% owned, so he's probably there for you, and he might be the best ad for the week. Now, going forward, Tampa Bay has a 4-game week. There's a couple of different options you can go to. Killorn is one of those tried and true tested guys that I like to come back to all the time. Usually pretty consistent. 5 assists in the last 7 games. Second line minutes, second power play unit. And you can see here, 85th percentile in points, 86th in goals, 81st in assists. So he'll get you some of that. Not a lot of anything else. Every now and then he gets on the power play. He's on the second unit, so not a ton of production there. But he's very consistent in getting you these 3 categories if that's what you're looking for. Now, it is worth mentioning that Ross Colton is relatively hot. A goal, 2 assists, 1 power play point in his last 3 games. But he could cool off with that extended break. If he doesn't, it is a decent option nonetheless. Now, Andrei Kuzmenko, this is something that we've been monitoring just because of the coaching change. I don't like his ownership percentage. It's too high for me at 50%, but he does have 4 goals in his last 6 games, just signed a new contract. He's playing top 6 minutes, getting some power play time, and who knows what the new coach will mean for him. Now, he's not that complete of a player, but if you look at his hub, 0.9 points per game. That's why his ownership is so high. 95th percentile in goals. That's really good. That's elite level. So this is why his ownership is that high. I'd like to see the shots come up a little bit. 1.7 is a little low for a guy who scores that many goals. If you're scoring that many goals, just take a couple more shots and you might bump yourself up a little bit. And he does get some power play production as well. So power play, assists, goals, and overall offensive production. Really good for Kuzmenko. But another guy I'm looking at for this potential coaching bump is Brock Besser. So he's obviously had his ups and downs, a lot more downs than ups lately. 3 assists in his last 3 games since the coaching change. His assist production has actually been much better than his goal production, which is kind of counterintuitive. You see his wrist shot and you think that he'd score a lot more, in terms of goals instead of assists, but that hasn't been the case. 2.2 shots is not bad. The power play production's okay, but this is a guy that I would hope would get a little bit of a bump from Rick Tocchet. And if it doesn't happen, hopefully he gets traded at the deadline, moves to a new situation, one that's a little bit less, I don't want to say toxic, but one that's a little bit more favorable for him and for you as his fantasy owner. 42% owned, that's way too high for me. So I'm not necessarily going to go there, but this is something to keep an eye on as they continue to get acclimated to Rick Tocchet. Now that's going to bring us to the Week 17 goalie streams, and a lot of these guys, so I covered a bunch of the longer term options in the previous week video. Some of these guys are long-term options, but most of these guys are literal just like back-to-back plays, because you're going to need some of those if you have a goaltender who's only playing 2 games during this stretch. You're going to need those guys who are getting a guaranteed start because of a back-to-back. So we have Kochetkov. He's at the top of the list for a reason. Freddie Anderson, day-to-day, this time it's an upper body injury, not a lower body, so it could be different. It might not be extended, but as soon as Anderson went down, Toe Dragons in my league, who I'm going to be battling for the championship with, if I can continue this production that I'm on, he picked him up immediately and kind of beat me to it. And then when I saw that, I grabbed him in every other league that I'm in just in case. He's one of the elite goalies on the Goalie Hub, so to get him at 18% ownership is excellent exposure, especially because you're getting Carolina's goaltender if Freddie Anderson goes down. Kochetkov was, I believe, 7-0-1 in a 8-game stretch in the middle of December, so he has the potential to be elite level in fantasy, so you might as well take the risk, especially if you have a comfortable lead heading into the next couple of weeks. Now, a guy that I own myself, and I've owned for a little bit, I wish he would have gotten a start this week. It wouldn't have screwed me over on the minimum start threshold. Philip Gustafson, 46% owned. He's either going to start against Dallas or Vegas on Wednesday or Thursday. There's a back-to-back there. I would imagine they're going to start him on the Vegas game on Thursday, just because I would imagine they'd give Fleury the Dallas game. But, maybe they'll do it the other way around and actually, maybe Fleury will be a little bit more motivated to play Vegas. So then he could potentially play this Dallas game, and that would be a low-scoring affair if it's Ottinger versus Gustafson. So that's something to keep an eye on. Watch the starting goaltenders that day. Make the decision for yourself. Semyon Varlamov, 37% owned. That's a back-to-back on Monday and Tuesday, the front half of the week, the front half of the second part of the week. So it's not this upcoming Monday, it's the following one. Philly and Seattle. So those are, if he gets the Philly game, that's an advantageous start. If it's the Seattle game, it's a little less. But I would imagine they would save Sorokin for Seattle and give him the Philly game. So that could be a nice place to start him if you have him available on your wire, because he is 37% owned. Guy who will be there for you on your wire is Felix Sandstrom. So the Flyers have a back-to-back on the weekend. Nashville and Seattle, those are not easy opponents, but Nashville doesn't score a lot. So if Sandstrom plays that Nashville game, which I would imagine he would, and I would imagine Hart gets this Seattle game, that would be a nice place to start him. And typically, Flyers backups have been sneaky fantasy relevant. Ersson was relatively fantasy relevant the time that he was there. Sandstrom had his moments earlier in the season, so something to keep an eye on. If you're in a deep league, this is definitely a play for later in the week that you might want to keep in the back of your mind. Heading to the bottom here, Philip Grubauer, 15% owned. They have that back-to-back against the Devils and Rangers on Thursday and Friday. Not a ton of travel there, so they're probably going to be slightly more rested than other teams that are on this, the back-to-back schedule with travel involved. And Grubauer will probably get one of those 2 games. I can't imagine which one. Both of those are very difficult opponents, and I don't know who they'd want Jones to start with. But yeah, just keep an eye on the starting goaltenders and pick up whichever game that Grubauer gets if you want that, because you're getting excellent team exposure. He's getting tons of run support, 3.6 goals per game, and they're relatively good defensively as well. So that could be a nice little pickup. But if you want the elite team exposure and a great spot start, it's Brian Elliott, 4% owned. He will probably start against San Jose on Tuesday, and that sets up really well for him and the Lightning. They play in Sunrise against Florida on Monday, that Monday after the All-Star break. So then they come back home to play San Jose on that Tuesday, which is a great spot on the second night of a back-to-back. So excellent exposure for Elliott. you're getting access to the Tampa Bay Lightning. They're probably a little bit more able to handle those back-to-backs as they get healthier heading into the second half of the season. But these are your goaltender ads for Week 17. I'm exhausted, so I'm just going to call the video here. My son woke me up at 5 a.m., so it's been a long one. But if you watched till the end, I want to thank you for doing that. I just created a Twitter. For all of you out there on Twitter, at @data_draft. Same thing on Instagram, at @data_draft. So you can follow me in both places. We'll have a little bit more coverage of roster updates and things like that going on, hopefully in the near future. But thanks again, and I will see you in the next one.